Ethiopia reiterates Africa's long-standing call that there should be more decentralization and deployment of institutional and financial capacity to the Global South, especially to the African continent, where the United Nations has most of its programs. Madam President, Africa, guided by Agenda 2063, is advancing development as its preferred security policy. The continent is scoring a higher rate of economic growth. Domestic revenue mobilization is on the rise. Africa's climate action in renewable energy development, emission reduction, and afforestation is indeed unmatched in any other parts of the world. Efforts to enhance public welfare, combat transnational threats, and decrease inequality are being intensified. Despite these achievements, the global crisis continues to impact Africa's capabilities to deliver on development aspirations. Chief among this is the compounding debt crisis. In line with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and Civil Outcome document, we emphasize the need to advance an ambitious agenda on development finance. Coercive measures and trade restrictions, in particular those targeting Africa, must be lifted immediately. More importantly, Ethiopia calls for a new global action for debt cancellation, restructuring, and suspension. Madam President, it is our view that the national security of states, especially those in the same region, is indivisible and interdependent. To this effect, we will intensify our efforts to combat global terrorists operating in our region. We call on the international community to extend the required support to the African Union peace missions, in particular the African Union Support and Stabilization Mission in Somalia. Now is not the time to retreat from global action in combating terrorism. Furthermore, we reiterate our call for urgent action to reform the United Nations Security Council. Africa's representation in both categories of membership of the Council must be given priority. There is no shortcut or half solution to this long-standing pursuit for justice.
That the current global financial architecture punishes poor countries with high interest rates and enormous conditionalities, while rewarding rich nations with lower interest rates and softer lending rates. Its rules, priorities, and allocation mechanisms consistently favor those already prosperous, while trapping vulnerable economies in cycles of debt, high borrowing costs, and inadequate access to emergency support and concessional funding. It is imperative to transform these institutions into genuinely independent, apolitical global bodies that their operations are aligned with their global mandate. Such a shift would democratize decision-making, restore credibility, and allow the IMF and the World Bank to serve all countries fairly rather than reinforcing old hierarchies. But Africa is not merely waiting for external prescriptions. We are taking bold and deliberate steps to strengthen our financial independence, safeguard our stability, and accelerate our development. Kenya, for instance, fully endorses the establishment of the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, launched with the Africa Union in February 2024. This alliance brings together our homegrown banks, Afrexim Bank, the Africa Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Bank, Shelter Africa Re, Africa Development Bank, Africa Trade and Investment Development Insurance, and ZEPRI, institutions that embody Africa's determination to mobilize resources, finance trade, and build resilience on our own terms. At the same time, the Africa Union is championing three transformative institutions: the Africa Central Bank, which will issue a single currency and free our trade from dependence on foreign money. The Africa Monetary Fund, positioned to stabilize our economies and give us true financial sovereignty. And the Africa Investment Bank, designed to mobilize resources for infrastructure, industrialization, and integration that Africa needs to rise. And to complete this vision, the Africa Credit Rating Agency, one that understands our realities, values our uniqueness, and tells our story with fairness and truth, has already been established. Excellencies, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, Africa also marks 20 years since the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, the two historic milestones that establishes the common African position on UN Security Council reforms. For 2 decades, Africa has spoken in one voice, demanding justice, equity, and representation in the highest organ of global governance. This demand, however, continues to be ignored, deferred, or endlessly debated to the detriment of both Africa and the legitimacy of the United Nations itself. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance while decisions about peace, security, and development are made without our understanding, without our perspectives, and without our voice. Africa's exclusion is not only unacceptable, unfair, and grossly unjust, it also undermines the very credibility of the United Nations, this organization. Africa dominates most of the Security Council agenda, provides some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeeping forces, and bears the heaviest costs of instability. Yet we remain the only continent without a permanent seat at the main table where decisions about our destiny are made. Africa deserves, ladies and gentlemen, at the very least, 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the right to veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. The world must understand that reforming the Security Council is not a favor to Africa or to anybody. It is a necessity for the United Nations' own survival. If the United Nations is to remain relevant in this century, it must reflect today's realities, not the post-war power arrangements of 1945.
As we celebrate 80 years of the United Nations, we must seize the opportunity to build a better United Nations for the next 80 years. What is needed now is a stronger and more capable United Nations, a United Nations that is based on the renewed commitment to its founding principles. We must invigorate the negotiations on the Security Council reform at the intergovernmental negotiations in the General Assembly, including by initiating text-based negotiations. The Security Council must be accountable. It must also be representative. It must be democratic and effective in executing its mandate. We can no longer accept that a large portion of the world's population is not represented in the United Nations Security Council. My own continent, Africa, home to 1.4 billion people, as well as South America, are not represented in the United Nations Security Council. This is unjust, this is unacceptable, and it must end. We want representation in the Security Council.
The UN Founding Charter is outdated when it comes to representation in this August Assembly. The most powerful post-World War II nations are still being rewarded with an almost totalitarian guardianship over the rest of the world. And yet, the first sentence in Chapter 2, Article 1 of the UN Charter declares that the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. If this were true, and was the case, a continent as large as Africa, with its numerous UN member states, would have at least one permanent seat on the Security Council. Furthermore, we believe that veto power should not be restricted to only 5 nations, nor should it be absolute. There must be a mechanism in this House for the General Assembly to challenge a veto. No single nation should be able to exercise an absolute veto to serve its own interests in a dispute. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, Nelson Mandela stood in this very spot, and he said, "The United Nations has to reassess its role, redefine its profile, and reshape its structures. It should truly reflect the diversity of our universe and ensure equity among the nations in the exercise of power within the system of international relations in general, and the Security Council in particular." I close quotations. 30 years later, we African leaders are still making the same simple request for a permanent seat on the Security Council with the power of a veto. So today, Madam President, I stand here in this exact spot and ask the world, if not now, then when? We demand not only a reform of the Security Council, but also a reset of the global financial architecture, which is currently rigged against Africa. Africa must have a greater say in the world's multilateral financial institutions.